Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be extending the accounts receivable app that was built in the previous one. You should see a link somewhere on this video if you want to watch that, if you haven't already. It's quite a long one. We cover start to finish of building all the core elements of an accounts receivable app. In this one we're going to be extending those features that we built in. So in this one what we're going to be doing is going through how to record payments and then allocating those payments to outstanding invoices. And again, we're just going to be going through the process of how you would do that. This one's going to be a lot shorter. We're not going to be going on for a long time like we did last time because we've already built out the core app in terms of the prototype. This one is just going to be adding bits of features, and we'll keep adding new videos where we're adding bits and bobs, and then we'll do a separate series where we're building it into, once we've got all the core concepts, build it into a proper real life, real world app, which essentially will be a lightweight version of what I have built commercially. So if you remember in the previous we had this add transaction button where they could put a new transaction in. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be building this out ourselves, but I'm just going to show you how it's going to look. So if you remember, you can select the transaction type, so you select payment, and this time you get this box at the bottom there which is going to list the outstanding invoices for the selected customer. So when we pick a customer, it will go away and it will go and get the outstanding invoices for that customer. And then what we can do there is we can click on one and we can see it selects it, and also you get this total in here as well, or we can select that one, or we can manually just type in our own amount, whether it's a part payment or it's an overpayment or an over allocation. And then obviously when they save it, we need to then deal with the processing necessary to do that. In addition, what we're going to be doing as well is tidying things up a little bit within the app, making it a little bit more usable. Although, like I say, this is only a prototype. We're really just proof of concepting things out for this accounts receivable app. And we'll also be looking at how we can optimize the way that the system calculates balances, and is there any way that we can improve on that, because optimization is a real key part of building a no-code app. Because if you just build it so that it works, in inverted commas works, you're not always guaranteed, once you start to get a lot of data in there and potentially scale it, you're not guaranteed that that speed is going to come with it. So it's important that you're always thinking about optimization. So we're going to be looking at how you can do that with calculating balances. Okay then, let's crack on. Right, so we're in our bubble editor and we want to add it to our pop-up, this payment allocations, when they click the add transactions button. So what we'll do, we'll go to our elements tree, and remember from last time we've got our pop-up new transaction, so we just click the eye to show that on the screen. So yeah, we've got our type, customer, date, reference and our total. So what we want to do is, as we've shown in that demo of an app that they've already built out, we want to show their transactions if they select payment as a type. So we'll give it room for that. So we will drop this down, give this a bit of space, and we will drop that in there. Okay, and what we want to do, because we're going to display a list of data just like we did last time, we're going to drop in a repeating group. And obviously, as I mentioned, as I shown last time, I always like to put everything in a group. There we go, and then drop the repeating group in there. Now in this one I'm going to be showing the headers outside of a repeating group cell. And the reason that I'm going to do that is because I want them to show you if there's no data showing in there, so that the user knows why it's there. So I'm going to give that a little bit of a gap at the top, a little bit of gap at the side, and so we've got a repeating group there. So what I'll do, the type of content for the repeating group is going to be a transaction, because we're going to get a list of transactions, and we will just give these naming things as I did last time. So we will say this is a new group, new trans allocation. Okay, and we'll give our repeating group the same name, new trans allocation. Right, okay, so we're going to be putting that in there. Now One of the things that we need to do here is to add a field into the database, because if you can imagine, all that we're storing at the moment is the total value of the transaction. We're not storing the total that's actually been paid on the transaction, which is obviously what we're going to need to store to get to store our allocations. So we'll go to Data tab, Transaction, create a new field, and we will call that Paid, and we will give that a type of a number, no problem at all. So let's go back to the design and our pop-up. So what I'm going to do here is just drop in some fields via text boxes. So just like we did in the last time when we were doing repeating groups. So you always drop it into the top cell. So I'm just going to show the let me set this to 22, and that's kind of the smallest it can be to show the data. So the first one is going to be the transaction type. So so we've set the type of content to transaction. We'll get to the data source in a moment, where it's going to get the actual data from. So in here we will say insert dynamic data, and we're going to say that this is going to be the current sales transactions type. Okay, I'm going to need to show display as well, so that it gets the information that's in the display, which is either going to be, in this case it will just be invoices. So remember, we just do control and drag, or command and drag, to copy that. Got enough gap between it? Yes, we have. So the next one we're going to add is going to be the date. So we'll just say transactions date, and then we're going to need to format that. And I always like to use a custom format type. I'm going to do day, MMM, YYYY. Okay, and that gives you the format in this here, just like this. Okay, next one is going to be the reference. So just let me, what I'm going to do here is just give us a little bit more space for the group. Hopefully I can line it up there, that's it. Give it a little bit so that what I want to line up is this first column with total. There we go. Okay, that's good. So let's just give that a little bit there. I don't think we need that much space, so we'll close up a little bit. Same with that one. Move it across. Okay, we'll create another copy. Control or command and drag. And this one will be the reference, which is just the text field for the reference. So okay, we've done that. And then we'll put the outstanding amount on the transaction. And that's why we needed the paid field, because obviously we just got the total for the transaction. We need to tell it that what we actually want to see is the total, take away the amount that's already paid. Okay, because obviously transactions could get part paid. So we're going to drag that across, and okay, we probably don't need the space a little bit. Let's drag that back. Is it going to go? Oh, I keep making copies. Okay, let's just make sure that's right aligned. So how we do that, we remove the style and then right align it on there. And up here we're going to change that to the now this time what we need to do is do a little bit of a calculation on this, because we want to say that it's the total take away the paid. So the way that we do that is quite simple. We'd say that the current sales transactions total, click more, minus current sales transactions paid. And then when we've got that calculation and we want to format the result, so we'll say formatted as, decimal place is 2. Yeah, okay. So we're just doing a quick calculation to say give us the outstanding amount, which is we can get by calculating the current sales transaction total, by subtracting the paid from the total, and that will give you what's outstanding on each invoice. Okay, so that's good. So we're going to now, like I said in the last video, is we'll make sure that we always group any related elements together. So we'll do that, right click after we've selected them all, and then select group elements in a group. Okay, and then we will name this group new trans allocation data. Okay, and now we just want to put the headers in the top. Now in the previous repeating groups that we've done, we've added the headers into the actual first cell, and then we've made it invisible and then just visible for the first record. But then that will only show the headers if there is a first record, if there is any data. In this one, we want to give the user a clue about what's going on even before any data is shown. So we'll put the header outside of the repeating group, but in the group itself. So what we'll do, we will make a copy of the, just let me extend this out a little bit. Remember, the golden rule with groups is to make sure you give it a little bit of a handle so that you can get at it, which I haven't done here, so I'm having to do that now. So hopefully, will it let me get it? Okay, so I've grabbed the group and I can just drag this out to give it a little bit of a handle. And then when I've got the handle, I can then do Control and drag, and I will drag that straight out of the group into the group itself. There it is. Okay, I've not dragged it into the group, so what I will need to do then is to just extend it, or I'll just need to be able to get at it. Just move it up that little bit until I can get it into the group. So I'll move that up there and then drag it until I see the red box around there, around the main group, and I think that should do it there. Okay, so I think everything's lined up. So then, just like we did last time, putting headers in, I'll just clear all these, clear each of the headers. Clear all, and then I can just put the standard text in there. This is going to be type. This is going to be date. This is going to be reference. I don't know what it is when I'm making these videos, my typing suddenly deteriorates. So this one is going to be outstanding. Okay, now we might not get this in, so oh, we do. Okay, but we're going to bold it, so I'll just, okay, we do have some space here actually, so what we'll do is I'll extend that group and that group and just move this a little bit so that we can make it that bit bigger. Okay, so let's just set these to our usual format of our headers. So we will remove the style, set it to bold, set the letter spacing to -1. We'll do that with the next one. Remove the style. Remember, when we remove the style, it means that we can then get it and change the styling of the individual element. Now, generally, I'm going to be honest, and I'll show this when we're building out a proper app. This is not something that you would do when you're building a full app. You will create your styles up front, like a style guide, and you will use those religiously throughout. Okay, but we're just doing this here for speed. So, okay. So we've got our headers there. Now then, the group itself, obviously we don't want that to display unless they actually select that it's a payment type. So what we can do is select the group, and we can say that it's not going to be visible on page load. Right, so we'll untick that. that also pops it up in here under the show hideable transaction elements, the show hideable elements. So what we can do now is to set a conditional to show it when they select a payment in this drop down. So to do that, we will say when the drop down of new transactions types value is, and then we can say payment. Okay, and then when that happens, select property to change. This element is visible, yes. So we've set it invisible, so it's got to meet this condition to make it visible. Now the other thing as well we want to do is to make sure that this space that it takes up is collapsed and isn't taken up if it isn't visible. So it'll stretch the pop-up if it's visible, it will shrink it if it's invisible. So the way to do that is collapse this element's height when hidden. So we tick that, and then that should show us that information there. Okay, so let's just check to make sure that is basically working. We're not going to get any data because we haven't set, so far we haven't actually set the data source up yet, and we're going to cover that in a second. So for now, let's go and preview this. And we'll click add transaction and we'll select payment. There we go. Okay, that's good stuff. So that's a start. Now then, we now come to the point where we need to decide on how we're going to get this data. So in the data source, we will do what we normally do, which is to do a search for, which is what we always select when we want to query some data. And we say type is obviously going to be transaction, and we need to add some constraints. Now when you think about what we want to do here, we want to limit this list to a list of invoices that are for this customer, for the selected customer, that are outstanding. So the way we do that, we'll add the customer in there first. So we'll say, okay, it's the business entity is going to be the business entity selected in this box, which is the search box. So search box new trans customers value. Okay, so that will limit it to the customer. Now what we want to do is to say, and we want to limit it just to invoices. Okay, so we'll say that the type is equal to invoice. Now the third constraint is that we only want to show those invoices for that customer that are outstanding. So if you think about how you would normally query this in a normal database, for example, is you would compare the total field with the paid field, and you'd say that if the total field is greater than paid, which means that paid is less than total, then it is outstanding. So therefore you would normally expect to say total, and then you would say is greater than, and then you'd expect to be able to select paid. Okay, Bubble doesn't give you that option. You can't do field comparison within the same data type. Okay, so you can say that's a limitation. It's just the way that Bubble handles the database in the background that it doesn't give you that option. So okay, so we're going to have to look for alternatives and ways of doing this, and there are essentially two alternatives to do it. The first one is to set a filter that will allow you to do same table field comparisons. So let's just get rid of that and let's see how we can do this. So at the moment we've got search for transactions, we've got a couple of constraints on there. So what we can do is to say more, and if we scroll down, we get a function, an option that we can select called filtered. Okay, and so what we can do then, based upon the query that we get back and based on the constraints that we set previously, we can then add an additional filter on the results that we get back. So what we can do here is to say add a constraint, and what we need to do first and foremost to be able to do field comparisons on a return data set, we need to select advanced. Okay, once we've done that, then we can do what we'd expect to be able to do, which is to say that this transactions total is greater than this transactions paid. Okay, and that will work absolutely fine, as we're going to show you next. Okay, so close that, and we will refresh our page. Add transaction, select the type is going to be payment, select our customer, and we will say, let's say KBT, select that. Okay, and then we get our transactions. We get 2 outstanding transactions, which is absolutely correct. That works, no problem at all. Okay, however, let me just explain why this isn't an ideal way to do it, and I've already hinted at it already. Okay, just before I do that, by the way, just something that's annoyed me. What you can do there is to stop any field going over onto the next line from wrapping. What you can do is say cut off content if the element is not tall enough. Okay, tick that, and that will stop that from happening. Okay, that's a slight digression there, sorry. With our data source here, what we're doing, as I've said, is we're doing a query, a search for, limiting it to the selected customers transactions and only those that are invoices, and then we're adding a separate filter to make sure that we only get those where the total is greater than paid, which gives us outstanding transactions. Now then, the problem is that if you can imagine, that's great for where you've got a few records or even a couple of thousand, it's no problem. Once you start getting into lots and lots of transactions, let's look at what it's doing here. This is the query. So this is going to the database, and it's going to say, get me that data. And it's getting all of that data that matches this criteria. Only when that comes back to the client is the filtered function getting executed for this. So you can imagine that you could have thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of transactions for this customer of type invoice that have been long gone, paid, in the distant past. But what it's going to do, that query is going to return all of those to the app, and then once it's got those, then it's going to run a filter on that condition. Okay, it will get you the result, but it's not optimal. It effectively is going to could return you back, potentially pass back hundreds of thousands of transactions in an extreme case back to the client, for the client to then run this. Now that's not great in terms of the bandwidth it's going to use, the server resources, and also the speed once that data gets back to the client, because then he's got to do like a manual check to filter this. Okay, I mean, early in my database development career, database app development career, you always taught that filters were kind of something that you would run on very small data sets. Well, this potentially may not be a small data set. So I would say that is not an optimal or an advised way to do it. Okay, so if we can't use this because it's not optimal, and we can't do our direct field to field comparison, what can we do? Okay, and this is where the database purists are probably now going to scream their heads off. Okay, but some denormalization is always required, no matter what type of database you're running. And if you're considering something like a NoSQL database, denormalization is actually normal. Okay, so when you're designing a database, designing an app, especially a no-code app, where you don't have absolute minutiae control over the different optimizations that you can do, you have to optimize in the best way that you can. And sometimes that does involve denormalization of data and adding new fields where perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily do that. Okay, so the best way to do it actually would be to say, let's just set this filter off there. Let's just set the filtered thing off there. So we're going to set the filter off. So we're just left with our query. So rather than do a calculation to determine is this field greater than that field, what about if we just had a field that contained the outstanding amount and just check if it's greater than 0. So the way we do that, again, fairly simple to add a field, create a new field, and we will say outstanding and the number, create. Okay, and back in the design, like I say, just say that the outstanding is greater than, and then we'll just put 0 in. Okay, and that way all of the querying gets done on the server, no problem. Okay, so then obviously we need to factor in that this needs to get populated, the outstanding amount on our database, when we're actually saving the transaction. Because obviously when you record a transaction, initially it won't have any payments, so if the invoice is 100 and there's nothing paid, the outstanding is 100. So that's something that we need to do on our saving transaction workflow. And it's just going to help us really optimize it so that everything is done on the server, so that what we actually get back is the correct data. There's no additional checking and filtering that we need to do, it's just all done. Okay, and again, I know from a database purist point of view that's not ideal, but what is ideal? What is ideal when you can build an app 10 times faster on a no-code platform, do a little bit of denormalization and deliver massive value to your customer? Surely that's the best way to build an app. So we have to work within the platform that we've got, and quite honestly, it's just a no-brainer of a trade-off, quite honestly, for me. Okay, so the first thing to do to implement this outstanding and also our new paid field that we've added as well is over here in data. What we can do is to fill these in manually. Now I'm not going to do that on the video because it'll just take up your time, so I'll do that now and I'll come back when I've done that. Okay, so I've added that data in there, and if we go back to our design and our pop-up, we'll be able to test it. One last thing I want to do before we do that is on this particular text label that shows the outstanding amount. If you remember, we did this calculation, which is fine. There's nothing wrong in that. We can leave that. But why, when we've got that set on a particular field now? So what I will do is I'll actually just clear this expression, and I will just say that I want to insert dynamic data, parent groups transactions, outstanding, formatted as okay, and that way it's just going to take the information directly from the field itself. Right, so let's have a look at this and make sure everything's as it should be. Add transaction, payment, sorry, one customer, let's say KBT, enterprises, yeah, all looks good to me in there. Right, okay, so let's crack on. Now what I want to do here, as you saw in the completed app, is I want to put a little tick down here to show which transaction has been selected when they click it. So we will do that now. So what we'll need to do is move things a little bit over, or at least shorten them. Okay. I won't shorten that any, it's already fairly short. Okay, the width of that is 101. Make sure that's set to 101 as well. Good stuff. Is that? Yes, that's right aligned. Okay, so then what we can do then is to add a little, got enough room in the group, let's add a little icon in here. Okay, what's the size of it? Well, let's say that's 1, and we'll make it 18 by 18, and what we want is the check, which is the tick. There we go. Okay, now again, we don't want that visible on page load because it's only going to be visible when they select it. So we'll untick that, and we will add a conditional. Let's name it first. We've been a little bit remiss so far in this one on naming things, but we only really need to name things that we know we're going to reference. If we want to move quickly, you know, you can name absolutely everything, and there's no harm in that. But we're trying to get through stuff here, so let's say that is selected or allocation select. Allocated selected trans. Okay. Naming things is the second hardest thing in software development, as they always say. So we've got that there. Let's add a conditional. So what's a conditional? How do we know to show this tick? Okay. What we need to do is to have a way to be able to click this, any listed outstanding invoice on here, and for it to know that that's the transaction that's been selected. So custom states is what we're going to use for this. So what we will do then is we will, on this group, which is the group that's containing all of our text elements that they can click on, we're going to add a start and edit workflow. So when new trans allocation data is clicked, then what we can do is add an action, and this time we're going to set a state, and we're going to set that on pop-up. And the custom state, at the moment we don't have one, so what we will do is we'll say we will create a new custom state, and we'll call this selected transaction. Okay, and the state type is going to be transaction. Okay, and then what we're going to set it to the value of is current cells transaction. So in other words, the actual transaction that's been displayed in the cell, the row, the record that they've selected will then be placed into this custom state. Okay, that's when they click it. And then what we can do here back in our design is to say on this that it's conditional. So we click define another condition, and what we're going to do, we're going to say when parent group's transaction, which is the transaction of the current cell that it's checking against, and we have a field here called unique ID, which is the unique identifier of each transaction that it displays. And what we're going to do, we're going to check that against the transaction that we've stored when the user clicked our group. And the way we do that is we compare it using is, and then we say, we go to our custom state, which is under pop-up, and we will say selected transactions, again, unique ID. So the way that we're comparing records is based upon the unique ID. Are they the same? In other words, is a transaction that's being displayed the same as what we've got stored? And if it is, great, we'll show the tick. And the way we do that, select a property when true, this element is visible, yes, okay. So let's just go over that slightly and just cover that again. So on the group that they can click, okay, we've got a workflow that says store the current sales transaction that they've clicked on into a custom state called selected transaction, and then in here on the conditional for the tick we say it's not visible by default when any record's unique ID is the same as the one that we've stored in the click event of the group. If it's the same, then yep, we want that visible. So give an indicator to the user that that's the transaction that they've selected. So let's give that a go. Select payment. And there we go. So if we click this, yeah, there we go. We can see the tick on there. So what we're doing at the moment, really, that's working fine. But what we're doing really is just selecting it and holding the selected transaction in memory in a custom state. We're not doing anything with the total here. So what we really want to do is that when they click a transaction, then it will place the total of that transaction, or the total outstanding of that transaction, into the total of the payment to make it easy for them. They can manually type in the total, but this is making it easy for them to just say, yeah, it's a payment for this customer. Oh yeah, they're paying this transaction, put it in, and then they can save it to make it really easy for them to allocate a payment against an invoice. So let's deal with how we're going to do with the total next. So what we're going to do, the way we're going to deal with this, is we're going to create a custom state, and then we're going to assign the custom state to this input box. Okay, so we'll do it on our pop-up. So like I say, what you can do to create custom states on any element is just to click this I, and then it says, gives us a custom state we've already created, add a new custom state. And in this one, what we're going to do is to just call this let's call it the total value. And that's going to be a number. Okay, and we're going to create that. And now we've created it, what we can do in the total is to say, where we've got initial content, there's nothing in there at the moment, we can actually assign that custom state's value into the initial content. So then what we can do is to say the pop-ups transaction, and then the total value that we just created, and we can just say formatted as if we want to. But actually we don't want that, because once it gets formatted as, it turns it into a text value. We want to keep it as that numeric value as it is, as Bubble tells us it evaluates to a number. Okay, and we've got the content format as a decimal anyway. So what that's going to do then is, as we click each one, we then want to put we then want to change this value. So we're assigning the initial content into the input box from the custom state. So we need to set the custom state when they click on it. Okay, so we've already got the workflow for that. So we're setting the state here. So all that we need to do then is to set another state, which is the total value that we've created. So we're going to say that the total value is going to be equal to current sales transactions outstanding. Okay, and what that will do then is fairly self-explanatory, is that when they click it, it's then going to run our workflow, and it's going to put whatever they've selected cells, that their selected record or transactions outstanding value, into the total value. And then because we've set this as the initial content for the total box, it's then going to put whatever we've put in the total value into the box. Let's give that a go. Payment. KB. Okay. And we can select that, and we can see that's exactly what it's doing, which is great. Okay. What I notice is that there was no initial value in there. So what we need to do really is to set up a way of ensuring that we get an empty value, a zero value, and also that the transaction that they select is empty each time that they run the pop-up. So the way that we do that is we in workflows, we already have our pop-up button, our button that pops up the pop-up. So what we're going to do there is, before we show it, let's insert an action, and we're going to go element actions and set the state. So what we will do there is to say pop-up transactions total value is going to be 0, and we will also set the selected transaction, and we'll just leave that as empty, just in case there's something filled in there that will set it to an empty value. Okay, so let's just give that a quick whirl. Okay, so yeah, we've got our empty value, and then we can just go ahead. Right, now there's something going on here, because we set our custom state as the initial content, right? And while nothing is manually typed in here, that will our link to our custom state value that we're changing here when we click on different transactions is being maintained. If I go in here and I type in 500, okay, suddenly this fails to work, because what the user has done by manually typing in a value is that is now the content of the input box, and it now is no longer referencing our custom state. Okay, so that kind of ruins what we want to do. Okay, they don't type anything and it's going to work, but we want it to work regardless. Okay, so let's see how we can deal with that. So fortunately we have this in a group, our total box. Let's just close it up. I don't think we need it that big. Okay, and we have our group that surrounds it. Now what we can do with this group here is to actually set a type of content and also a data source for that content. So at the moment it's set to transaction, but if we set that type of content to a number instead, let's just clear that expression, and let's say the data source actually of the group is going to be our custom state. So pop up new transaction, total value. Okay, now what's going to happen is, because this is fed into, because we've set the type of content and the data source of the content to the group, and we only have one item on there that's able to receive that type of content, what will happen is, even if they manually override it, okay, if we then change that, it will automatically feed in this data source. And this is a great feature of Bubble, that all groups have a type of content and a data source, and you can set it and populate it any way that you like. So, you know, all these are fine, they're being fed through from the actual pop-up, which we've set as a transaction. And what we've done there is, with this one, we're going to set it to be a number, and it's going to be our custom state that gets set when we click on each transaction. Okay, so let's give that a go. Payment again. Okay, so that works, absolutely, that's fine. Let's say we put 500 in. Okay, that's fine. Now let's say we click this. Yeah, now it's working again. Okay, so the thing is that there's no direct data binding in, if you're a program and you use Vue or Angular or React or whatever, where there's data binding, there's not specific data binding in Bubble. All that we can do is set it what the initial content is going to be, but then that gets overridden if they make a manual entry. So to compensate for that, we can set it on the group a type of content and force that through, and Bubble will recognize that there's one input that accepts a number, and that whenever we make a change to data using this, then it will populate that through, and it's a form of data binding. Okay, and it's just to be able to allow us to set it. Now sometimes you may just, it's actually done on purpose, you may just want to set it as initial content and you don't want it to change if they manually override it. Okay, but then from the back end, if you do want to do that, then we can set this up on the group. Obviously you've got to tightly define your groups, because if you've got lots of controls in there and then you're just setting one value, then all of those values will get populated with that, and you don't want that. So you create a group specific to the input. Obviously we've got a text and an input, but the text isn't affected by that, and therefore we can do that. So that's just a little bit of how to do your own type of hand-rolled data binding in Bubble, and that works great for us. So what we're going to do next is we're going to save this transaction. So if you remember from the original video, we've already got a workflow on our save button that does all of the work to save a transaction. However, we now added two new fields. One is called outstanding and one is called paid. So we'll deal with the paid one in a second, because we need to deal with the allocation that we're setting up. But in terms of creating the new transaction, we obviously need to add that in there. So in our save workflow, we have our step 3, which is the one to create a new transaction. And what we can do there is simply just set the outstanding value to the same value as the total, because there's nothing been paid so far and the outstanding is just the same as the total effectively. So let's select the outstanding. Is going to be input new trans total value, and we're also going to set the new paid field, and that is going to be just 0 on there. Okay, and so that just sets up the new transaction before we actually deal with the allocations. Okay, so that will work for us. So obviously we're going to do all of these things, triggering the calculate balance, but first and foremost, let's now deal with the allocations. So what we will do, similar to when we developed a custom workflow, a custom event for calculating a balance, we will create a custom event for a workflow to record payment allocations, because we may want to trigger them in other places in the system. So let's just define that. So we will say that we're going to do a custom to create a new event, and we're going to call the event name record payment allocation. Okay, the type of thing, we're going to have it receive a transaction. Okay, so what we can do in here in our save transaction workflow is we can insert an action after we've created a new transaction, but before we trigger the calculate balance. And we can say insert an action, and we can say in here that we are going to call a custom event, trigger a custom event, and this time it's going to be record payment allocations, and we're going to pass in the transaction that we create in step 3, so that's going to be a result of step 3. Okay, so in other words, what's going to happen is we're going to create a payment transaction, and then we're going to trigger this. So what we want to do then is to create a conditional, in that we only want to trigger this based on 2 conditions. Okay, first and foremost, that it's a payment transaction, and secondly, that a invoice transaction has been selected as the allocated invoice. So let's do that. So we will say that only when, and we will say the new drop down new trans type, its value is a payment, and that the custom state, which is on our pop-up, selected transaction is not empty. Okay, so we're going to call our record payment allocations, but we only want to do that if it's a payment and if we've actually selected something to allocate to, essentially. And let's just check out our back in design, or let's check out the actual app itself. So what can we do with this? So what we can do, we can select those, but also we can part allocate. So we can say we've picked the transaction, but we can say actually we're going to only pay 100 against that. So maybe we're only allocating 100, so we need to read the value in this box. Or maybe you put a transaction in for 300, okay? So if you're allocating 193, that means that there is 107 that's not going to get allocated. So we need to make sure that the outstanding value is updated accordingly on both transactions, depending on what they type in. So let's see how we can do that back in our workflow, and let's go to our record payment allocations. So what we need to do then is to find out what's the actual amount that we are actually going to allocate. What can we allocate to both the payment and the invoice that we're allocating it against? Because like I just said, we can underpay and we can overpay. We need to make sure that we're getting that right. So the main thing is that if they over allocate, we don't want to be recording an amount that's allocated or paid that's above the actual total of the transaction. So let's just check that out now. So we'll add an action, and what we need to do is to store the value that we're actually going to allocate into a variable, into a custom state, so that we can use that later on. So to do that, as always, element actions and set state, and we're doing everything on the pop-up, so we'll use that. Custom state, we will need to create another one. and we will say that this one is allocated value. Okay, and that's going to be a number as well. Okay, so what we need to know then is if the amount that they've entered onto the payment, if that amount is higher than the actual invoice that we're allocating it to, the outstanding that's on the invoice that we're allocating it to, we need to know that, because then we're going to need to make a calculation. So let's say that only when current workflows transaction, which is the payment that we passed in, okay, only when the total of that is greater than, and this time we have to compare it to the transaction that we're allocating it to, which is in our custom state. So we'll say pop up new transactions, selected transaction, and then we can say outstanding value. Okay, so let's say, for example, that we've put in a total of the payment of £500, but what's outstanding on the transaction that we're allocating it against is only 200. So we know that if the current workflows transaction, the payment total, is greater than what we've got on the outstanding value, then therefore the amount that we can actually allocate on both the payment and the invoice is just allocated invoices outstanding value. So the value that we assign to the allocated value will be the pop-up new transactions, selected transactions outstanding. So we know that. Okay, so then as an alternative to that, then we need to have another workflow that says if it isn't greater than. Okay, so therefore if let's again add an element action, set state. Okay, and then we will say that that's on the pop-up again. Let's put our only when, our conditional. So what we can say is that the current workflows transactions total is going to be less than or equal to, which Bubble has as this less than with a little underscore underneath it, and then we're going to get the allocated transaction is less than or equal to outstanding. So that means that this time the total we've put is exactly the amount that we've allocated that's outstanding on the allocated transaction, or it's even less than. In other words, it's a part payment. So in that case, the amount we're going to use is a total on the pop-up, on the current workflows transaction total. So we can say there the allocated value is going to be current workflows transactions total value. Okay, and again, we just put in a conditional to make sure that we know what the allocated value is that we're going to record on both the payment and the transaction. Right, now we know the value we're going to allocate. Now we know what we can update each transaction with. So we'll update the payment first, and we will say that we want to make a change to a thing, and the thing is going to be the current workflows transaction. Again, that's the payment, and we're going to need to make a change to the paid. And so what we're going to do there is to actually get the paid, and we're going to pick up the value that's already on the current workflows transaction, because there could already be a value already paid. Now we know that there isn't actually on this one, but we could want to use this record payment allocation in other places, so we can't rely on that. So we have to make sure that the paid is going to be take into account the amount that's already paid. So we can say the current workflows transactions paid, and then we're going to say plus, and then we're going to say the pop-up transactions allocated value. So if paid is 0, it's going to say, well, paid is going to be equal to 0, what it already is, plus the amount of allocated. Let's say there's £50 already paid on the transaction. It's going to say paid is equal to 50 plus what we've already allocated. Now then we need to do the outstanding value as well, because that needs to reduce by the same value. So what we can do there is to say outstanding current workflows transactions outstanding. Again, we've got to take into account what's already there, and we will say minus the pop-up transactions allocated value. Okay, so we're updating two values, the paid by increasing it by what's already there plus what we're allocating now, and the outstanding, reducing the amount that's outstanding on the payment in terms of what's unallocated by what's already there minus what we've actually put on this transaction. Okay, and we can just copy this, so we can say copy and we can paste it in, because we're going to do the same thing but this time for the invoice that we've allocated against, which is stored on the custom state. So thing to change, we need to change that one. This is going to be pop up new transactions, selected transaction, and this time we're just going to change these values here. So that's going to be, again, pop up new transactions, selected transaction. So we're then going to transactions paid, okay, plus, and again we're going to use the allocated value. And the same with this is selected transaction, outstanding, minus the allocated value, custom state. Okay, and that way we're updating, with the allocation, we're updating both the payment and the invoice to make sure that they both get updated with the allocation that's been recorded for them. Okay, and then this custom state, we can run this again and again and again, so that we know we're getting a transaction in, which is the payment, and then where we're grabbing the other transaction that's allocated against it or by it, we're grabbing that from pop-up new transaction, selected transaction. Now we can change that. If this becomes really generic, we can change this at some point, and certainly you would want to, because you know that way it's truly generic, you can call it from anywhere in the system. Okay, so let's just see if this works. Let's make sure we're doing everything right. So on the new trans save, let's just look, we're setting the states, we're creating the transaction, we're then triggering our payment allocations. Again, that's a conditional based on if they've allocated something and it's a payment. We're then triggering the calculate balance that we did before, and everything's the same as it was before. So let's go ahead and just see if that works. Okay, we will refresh the page. The first one we'll do is just a straightforward, we'll just tick a transaction and then allocate it against it. So we will say that's a payment, the customer says KY, or is it KB? Yep, KB. Okay, and okay, we'll just put a quick reference in there, 000, so we know what it is, and I'm just going to pick this one here for 193 and make sure what should happen is that this should be fully allocated and the invoice should be fully allocated. So let's just save that. Okay, let's go back in our data and refresh it. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so on our new payment, we've got a paid of 193, 0 outstanding, and on our invoice that we allocated it against, this one, it's paid 193, nothing outstanding at all. So what should happen then is, if we go into our app and click new transaction and we do payment, and we should say KB, we should see that there's only one transaction left. Okay, KB Enterprises, and if you look here, there's actually the balance has been updated as well. So let's go in and add a new transaction. This time we will say let's say this one is JJD. Oops, JJD. Okay, there's only one transaction, that's 650, so we'll click it, but let's say we're only going to pay 200 off that now. So what should happen there is that this will be 200, the payment, with that'll be fully paid, nothing outstanding, but this will still have an outstanding value of 451 on it, and with a paid value of 200. So let's save that. Let's check it out. So there's our transaction, 200 outstanding. Yep, there we go, paid 200, 451. And if we go to our app and we do another transaction, and we're going to say payment, and we will say JJD, that transaction will appear, but just with 451 in there to be allocated. Okay, so we've pretty much done our allocations in this one, which is really what we wanted to do. Obviously there's over allocations as well, so I suppose that we should test that. Let's do EDK Tech. Okay, Tech, we've got one transaction, so let's say pay 2, so I know which one it is. Now let's say that they're doing 300. Okay, so the payment record is 300, but because I'll tell you what I'll do, we should have selected that first, shouldn't we? 300. Okay, right, 300. So what should happen there is that we record a payment for 200, only allocate do a payment for 300, only allocate 200 because that's the maximum value on there, and then that invoice should be fully allocated. So that's on the 5th of October for EDK, so let's save that. Excellent. Let's check the data. Yeah, there we go. So that's the payment. It's paid to, it's for, the value is 300, paid 200, 100's outstanding, and our transaction here, which was for this one here, yeah, 200. So this invoice has been fully paid and no outstanding. So our workflows are working great with that respect. Okay, so we're sort of using up a lot of time, but I just want to briefly explain, and maybe we will implement it in this one because we have run out of time. I don't really want to go on too long in this. Is in terms of calculating balances. So let's just have a look at how we calculate balances now, which we had to do it this way because previously we just had the total value. We've introduced the outstanding and the paid in this one. So let's have a look at our workflows and go to calculate balance, make changes. So we just update the balance and we just say we're going to calculate transactions value sum. So if you remember, the value was a value that we stored specifically based upon whether it was an increase or a decreased transaction. So in other words, it would store a minus value for a credit and a payment, and it would store a positive value for an invoice or whatever. So let's just have a look at that. Now, if you can imagine what's going to happen there, there's no real constraint on this other than for the specific customer that you're asking to calculate the balance for. So if you imagine, you could have that customer, if you're using the system a number of years, or it's really been used heavily and they're buying a lot of, they're recording a lot of transactions for that customer, you could, before you know it, have thousands upon thousands of transactions. And every single time you're asking it to calculate, it's got a, okay, it's summing. And hopefully in the background, Bubble is indexing that sum, so it'll be pretty quick. But iterating through, transactions going back to the beginning of time, transactions that have long been since paid, long been since dealt with. And actually, when you think about it, you may only have maybe, even with a customer that's recording, hundreds and hundreds of transactions on a regular basis, you may only have a couple of dozen or, say 50 at the most that are actually active that have an outstanding balance on them. So ideally, what you want to do to optimize that, rather than calculate every transaction and adding up the ones that have been invoices and taking away credits and payments, what we want to do is just be looking at the outstanding transactions, and that will optimize for it. So let's say you've got a customer that's got 10,000 transactions going back 5 years, okay, but actually he's only got 24 that are active now. If we put a constraint based upon just looking at the outstanding transactions, whether that's payments or credits or invoices, it will only deal with the active and current transactions in terms of getting them the balance, rather than going back to the beginning of time and calculating everything from day one to get to this point. So it's a much more optimized way of calculating the balances. Now, what we'll do in the next video, we'll come to that, because to be honest, doing the allocations has taken a lot longer than I expected, so I won't do it in this video. But in the next one, I'll cover how to optimize this balance calculation to make it much faster, especially at scale and with a lot of data in there. But listen, thanks again for taking your time to watch this. I know it's been another long one, not quite as long. But like I say, we'll keep adding new little features into this app just to get you the concepts and the proof of concepts and the prototyping, and bit by bit we'll move towards putting this altogether into a proper real world with, you know, with all of the bells and whistles, with a fancy interface, and we'll move that. That'll be a much longer process, so I'll split that down into smaller chunks on that one. And also, you know, we won't limit ourselves to account receivables. I'm already going through the process of putting together a full inventory app that we can put together, because Popup just makes it so easy to put features in there that you may as well make your app as featureful as you possibly can within reason. Listen, thanks again for joining me, and I hope to see you very soon. Take it easy.